a stoic protector, having built an empire of steel and silence, returned to the ghost of his childhood home only to be paralyzed by the sight of a small, frail boy gasping for breath on the porch of the house next door. The boy's mother, a woman with a smile as bright and hard as polished marble, waved a dismissive hand at the child's distress, her laughter tinkling like broken glass against the humid afternoon air. Why would a child be forced to plead for the very air he breathes in his own mother's yard, and whose gilded cage truly deserved to be shattered and brought into the unforgiving light? Julian Vance had left this neighborhood a lifetime ago, a boy with nothing but calloused hands and a fire in his belly. He returned a man forged in the crucibles of corporate warfare, a millionaire whose name was a whispered legend in boardrooms across the country. He'd bought his old house back not for nostalgia, but as a monument to the distance he had traveled, a quiet testament to a past he had conquered. He expected the ghosts of his own youth to haunt the manicured lawns and freshly paved streets, not the living specter of a neglected child. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 6, was painfully thin, his t-shirt hanging off his bony shoulders like a surrendered flag. His face was pale, his lips tinged with a faint blue, and his small chest hitched with a desperate, rasping sound that tore at something deep inside Julian. "Mom, I can't breathe," the boy wheezed, his voice a tiny thread of sound. His mother, Isabella, turned from her conversation with a delivery driver, her perfectly coiffed hair catching the sun. "Leo, stop being so dramatic," she called out, her tone a chilling blend of impatience and amusement. "You're fine. Go sit down," the driver chuckled, oblivious, and handed her a package before driving away. Isabella signed for it, her attention already on the contents, leaving her son to struggle alone on the top step. Julian stood frozen behind the sheer curtains of his new living room, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had seen predators in his life, men who hid their ruthlessness behind expensive suits and charming smiles, and he recognized the same vacant cruelty in Isabella's eyes. The house was pristine, a modern architectural marvel of glass and white stone, but a palpable wrongness emanated from it, a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He watched as the boy, Leo, finally collapsed onto the steps, his breathing shallow, his small body trembling. A quiet, unbreakable vow began to form in the deepest recesses of Julian's soul, a promise etched in the steel of his resolve. He had failed to protect someone once before, a long time ago. He would not fail again. In the days that followed, Julian's house became a silent watchtower. He worked from his home office, the window of which offered a clear, unobstructed view of Isabella's property. His life, once a whirlwind of international flights and high-stakes negotiations, slowed to the agonizing rhythm of a child's neglect. He saw Leo left alone in the backyard for hours, a small, solitary figure listlessly pushing a toy truck through the dirt. He saw expensive cars come and go, saw Isabella and her slick, athletic boyfriend, Mark, leave for lavish dinners, leaving the house dark save for a single, dim light in an upstairs window. One evening, a cold front swept through, bringing a biting wind and a lash of icy rain. Julian was about to close his curtains when he saw him. Leo was on the back patio, huddled against the sliding glass door, shivering in only a thin pajama set. The door was locked. He was trapped outside. A primal rage, cold and sharp, seized Julian. He strode out his back door, grabbing a thick woolen blanket from his sofa as he went. He vaulted the low, decorative fence that separated their properties without a second thought. "Hey, son," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Leo flinched violently, scrambling back against the glass, his eyes wide with a terror that was far too old for his face. He didn't speak. He just watched Julian with the wariness of a cornered animal. "It's okay," Julian said gently, kneeling. "I'm Julian. I live next door. You look cold." He held out the blanket. Leo stared at it, then at Julian's face, his little mind clearly struggling to process an act of simple kindness. Slowly, tremulously, he reached out and took it, wrapping it around his shaking shoulders. As he did, the boy's pajama sleeve slid up, revealing a constellation of dark, ugly bruises on his forearm, bruises that looked unervingly like the imprints of an adult's fingers. Just then, headlights swept across the lawn. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Isabella and Mark emerged, laughing, their arms laden with shopping bags. Their laughter died when they saw Julian with Leo. "What are you doing on my property?" Mark demanded, his voice low and menacing as he stalked toward them. Isabella rushed forward, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Oh my goodness, Leo. You naughty boy. You locked yourself out again." She scooped him up, her touch more like a seizure than an embrace. "He's just so mischievous," she said to Julian, her smile not reaching her cold, appraising eyes. "Thank you for your concern, but we have it under control." Julian stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Mark. He was freezing. "He's been out here for at least an hour." Isabella's smile tightened. "A misunderstanding. He was supposed to be with his sitter, who clearly wasn't paying attention." "She's fired." Of course, it was a lie, smooth and effortless. As she carried Leo inside, the boy looked over her shoulder at Julian, his eyes pleading, silent. In that moment, Julian's vow solidified from a whisper of intent into an unbreakable covenant of action. He would not just watch. He would act. He would tear down their perfect, whitewashed world stone by stone if he had to. The vow was a familiar weight, a ghost of a promise he'd made in another life, to another vulnerable soul. He had been young then, powerless, and his failure had haunted him for 20 years, fueling the relentless drive that made him a millionaire but left him a solitary man. Looking at Leo's terrified face, Julian knew this was a chance to silence those ghosts, to rewrite a history of helplessness with an ending of justice. He would not be powerless this time. The next morning, he approached Isabella as she was getting her mail. He kept his tone even, non-confrontational. "Good morning," he started. "I was concerned about Leo last night. He seemed to be having trouble breathing again. And he was very cold." Isabella's demeanor shifted instantly. The neighborly warmth evaporated, replaced by a defensive frost. "As I said, it was the sitter's fault." "It's been handled," she said sharply. "Leo has asthma, but it's very mild. He can be quite the little actor when he wants attention." She was already building her narrative, painting Leo as a problem child and herself as the long-suffering mother. It was expert-level gaslighting. "I also noticed some bruising on his arm," Julian pressed quietly, watching her face for a crack in the facade. For a flicker of a second, her eyes darted with panic before the mask slammed back into place. "He's a boy," she scoffed, forcing a light laugh. "He plays rough. Honestly, I appreciate your concern, but it's starting to feel a bit like you're overstepping. We're new to the neighborhood, and we'd like our privacy." Mark appeared at the door then, a silent, broad-shouldered threat. He didn't speak, just stood there, polishing a golf club, his eyes locked on Julian. The message was clear. "Back off." Julian gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Of course," he said, his voice betraying nothing of the cold fury churning within him. "My apologies." He turned and walked back to his house, the charade over. He knew now that diplomacy was a dead end. They were not neglectful parents. They were calculating abusers, skilled in the art of deception. The fight wouldn't be won over offense. It would be won with evidence, with power, and with the complete and utter destruction of their carefully constructed lies. Julian's first call was to a man named Marcus Thorne, a private investigator who owed him a significant debt. Thorne was discreet, relentless, and unburdened by a surplus of ethical quandaries when it came to his methods. "I need everything on Isabella Carmichael and her boyfriend, Mark Renshaw," Julian said, his voice clipped. "Financials, past relationships, work history, any legal trouble, sealed or otherwise. I want to know what they had for breakfast, and I want a full surveillance package on the house. Audio, video, everything." While Thorne began his digital excavation, Julian started his own, more delicate work. He began taking walks around the neighborhood in the late afternoon, when people were returning from work. He exchanged pleasantries, his calm, wealthy demeanor putting most at ease. Most of the residents were new, like him, drawn by the area's resurgence. They saw only what Isabella and Mark wanted them to see: a happy, successful couple with a difficult child. But then he found Mrs. Gable. She was a relic of the old neighborhood, a woman in her late 70s who had lived in the same small bungalow for 50 years. She was watering her petunias when Julian approached. Her smile was hesitant, her eyes constantly flicking toward Isabella's house. "You're the fellow who bought the old Miller place," she said, her voice a soft, papery rustle. "Brave man. A lot of history there." Julian steered the conversation gently. "I'm still getting to know the neighbors. The family next door to me, the Carmichaels." Mrs. Gable's hands stilled. The cautious warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a deep-seated fear. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful there," she breathed. "That man, Mark, he has a terrible temper. I hear things. Shouting. The little boy crying. Sometimes late at night." She told him how Isabella had been a different person before Mark moved in a year ago. She had been warmer, more attentive to Leo. Now she was a stranger, brittle and cold. "She leaves that poor child alone all the time," Mrs. Gable confessed, wringing her hands. "A few weeks ago, I saw her lock him in the garden shed for an hour because he spilled juice on the rug. I wanted to call someone, but Mark saw me watching. The way he looked at me," her voice trailed off. She was terrified, but she had given Julian his first piece of corroborating testimony. He was no longer just a suspicious neighbor. He was a witness with validation. The war had begun, and he had just found his first reluctant soldier. The investigation deepened, weaving a grim tapestry of deceit and cruelty. Julian continued his quiet vigil, his heart aching with every glimpse of Leo's lonely existence. He started leaving small gifts by the fence line: a perfectly ripe apple, a small, brightly colored toy car, a warm muffin from the bakery. At first, the items remained untouched. Then, one afternoon, he watched from his window as Leo crept to the fence, looked around furtively, and snatched the toy car before darting back into the shadows of his yard. A fragile line of communication had been opened. A few days later, a piece of paper was pushed under the fence from Leo's side. It was a child's drawing, rendered in shaky crayon. The picture was stark and terrifyingly clear. It showed a very small stick figure locked inside a dark, boxy shape with angry red scribbles all around it. Outside the box stood a much larger stick figure with a wide, cruel slash for a mouth. In the corner, a yellow circle, the sun was crying black tears. It was Leo's silent testimony, a primal scream on paper. Julian carefully placed the drawing in a file that was growing thicker by the day. Thorne, the investigator, was proving his worth. He uncovered that Mark Renshaw was a failed real estate developer with a history of aggressive business dealings and 2 sealed assault charges from his youth. More damningly, he was systematically draining Isabella's finances. But the true horror lay in the documents Thorne managed to unearth regarding Leo. Leo had a trust fund, left to him by his biological father who had died in a car accident 4 years prior. The money, a substantial sum meant for his health, education, and welfare, was being siphoned off into Mark's failing businesses through a series of shell corporations set up by Isabella. They weren't just neglecting Leo, they were robbing him. The final, sickening piece of the puzzle fell into place when Thorne got his hands on Leo's medical history. It documented a dozen emergency room visits in the past year for acute asthmatic episodes. Several of the attending physicians had noted parental noncompliance with medication, and one had even filed a report with Child Protective Services. But the case was closed after Isabella gave a stellar performance as a frantic, overwhelmed, but deeply caring single mother. The phrase from that first day echoed in Julian's mind: "Mom, I can't breathe." It wasn't drama. It was a literal plea. Thorne's source, a disgruntled hospital administrator, also provided a crucial detail. Isabella and Mark frequently forgot to pack Leo's emergency inhaler for him when he was sent to school or to a sitter, and they would delay taking him to the hospital during an attack. They were using his life-threatening condition as a tool of punishment and control. This was the weapon Julian needed. It was cold, documented, and irrefutable. This was no longer just about neglect. It was about a slow, deliberate attempt on a child's life for financial gain. The rage inside Julian burned away any remaining hesitation. He would not just save the boy. He would utterly destroy the monsters who were hurting him. With a file thick enough to serve as a tombstone for Isabella and Mark's life of lies, Julian went to see Evelyn Reed. She was a corporate lawyer by trade, the sharpest legal mind he had ever employed, but her early career had been in family law, fighting for abused children. She had the mind of a shark and the heart of a warrior. She listened in her stark, minimalist office as Julian laid out the entire story, his voice a low, controlled monotone. He presented the evidence one piece at a time. Mrs. Gable's testimony, the financial records showing the theft from Leo's trust, the damning medical files, and finally, Leo's heartbreaking drawing. Evelyn studied the crayon stick figures, her expression hardening from professional interest to cold fury. "They're using his asthma as a weapon," she said, her voice tight. "This is beyond neglect. This is depraved indifference to human life. We have more than enough for an emergency custody order and to press for criminal charges." Julian nodded. "I don't want them to have a chance to run or to hide the money. I want it to be public. I want them to have nowhere to go." Evelyn's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "A public implosion. I like it. A quiet call to CPS lets them lawyer up. We need to detonate this in a place where their reputation is their only currency." Thorne's surveillance had provided the perfect venue. In 2 weeks, Isabella and Mark were scheduled to co-chair the city's most prestigious charity event, the Starlight Gala for Children's Wellness. The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. They would be on a stage, accepting accolades for their supposed dedication to children, surrounded by the city's elite. "That's our stage," Julian said, a grim finality in his tone. Evelyn agreed. She began making calls, lining up their allies. She contacted a trusted, senior agent at CPS, a woman who had seen it all and was weary of abusers who slipped through the cracks. She prepped the evidence for the district attorney's office, ensuring that when the hammer fell, it would fall with the full weight of the law. Julian, meanwhile, reached out to Mrs. Gable. He sat with her in her small, cluttered living room, explaining the plan. He promised her full protection. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, a flicker of righteous steel. "That little boy deserves a voice," she said, her frail hands clenched into fists. "I'll be there." The plan was set. The allies were in place. The trap was baited with the one thing Isabella and Mark craved more than money: public adoration. As the day of the gala approached, the pressure began to tell. Isabella and Mark, cocooned in their arrogance, must have sensed a change in the atmosphere. Julian's quiet, persistent presence was a stone in their shoe. They decided to make a preemptive strike. One evening, Mark was waiting for Julian as he pulled into his driveway. He leaned against Julian's gate, his muscular arms crossed, the picture of casual intimidation. "You need to stop watching my house," Mark said, his voice a low growl. "Whatever you think you know, you don't. You're a lonely man with too much money and too much time on your hands. Find a new hobby before this one gets you into trouble. You can't buy your way out of." Julian got out of his car, his movements calm and deliberate. He was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed an aura of unshakable stillness that unnerved people like Mark, who relied on bluster and physical threats. "Is that a threat?" Julian asked, his voice quiet. Mark just smirked. It's advice. The next day, 2 police officers appeared at Julian's door. Isabella had filed a harassment complaint, citing his unwanted attention and erratic behavior. She had twisted his concern into an obsession, painting him as a dangerous stalker. Julian calmly explained his side, his demeanor and reputation lending him credibility. The officers were professional but non-committal, leaving him with a formal warning. It was a classic move, designed to discredit him, to poison the well before he could speak. They thought it would make him back down. They were wrong. It only hardened his resolve. The warning was a gift, proof of their calculated malice. He faxed a copy to Evelyn, who added it to the growing mountain of evidence. They had shown their hand, and in doing so, had helped build the very gallows from which they were about to hang. The grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled elite, who sipped champagne and bid fortunes on silent auction items. On the main stage, beneath a massive banner that read Starlight Gala for Children's Wellness, Isabella Carmichael was at the podium, a vision in emerald silk. She dabbed a perfectly timed tear from her eye as she finished her keynote address. "And so, when we look into the eyes of a vulnerable child," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "we must see not a burden, but a sacred trust, a promise we must all vow to keep." The room erupted in thunderous applause. Mark stood beside her, beaming, placing a proprietary hand on her back. They were the picture of philanthropic perfection. At that moment, a side door opened, and Julian Vance entered. He was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored black suit. He was not on the guest list, but his reputation preceded him. The security guards simply stepped aside. He was flanked by Evelyn Reed, who carried a slim leather portfolio, and two stern-faced individuals who did not belong in this opulent setting. As Isabella raised her hand to quiet the applause, Julian began to walk toward the stage. His steps were unhurried, his presence a sudden, jarring note in the symphony of self-congratulation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Isabella's smile faltered as she saw him. "Excuse me," she said into the microphone, her voice tight with annoyance. "Security, we have an uninvited guest." Julian didn't stop until he reached the foot of the stage. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said, his voice calm but carrying with unnatural clarity in the now silent room. "You speak of sacred trusts. I'd like to talk about the trust you were given for your son." Leo, panic flashed in Isabella's eyes. "This is absurd. This man has been harassing me for weeks," she exclaimed, turning to the audience for support. But Julian was already moving to the next beat. Evelyn handed him a remote. He clicked it. The massive screen behind Isabella, which had been displaying images of smiling children, flickered to life. It showed a bank statement with highlighted transfers from the Leo Carmichael Trust to a shell corporation owned by Mark Renshaw. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. "You've stolen over $200,000 from your son's future," Julian stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He clicked the remote again. A series of medical admission forms appeared, each one detailing an emergency visit for a severe asthma attack. "You have systematically weaponized your son's medical condition, withholding his life-saving medication as a form of punishment." Isabella began to scream, a torrent of denials and accusations. "He's lying. It's all lies." Mark moved toward the edge of the stage, his face purple with rage, but one of the stern-faced individuals with Julian stepped forward, subtly opening his jacket to reveal the badge of a police detective. Mark froze. The final piece of evidence was not a document, but a person. From the side of the room, Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "I've seen it," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Isabella. "I saw you lock him out in the rain. I heard him crying for you. I heard him cry that he couldn't breathe, and you did nothing." The spell was broken. The elegant facade of Isabella Carmichael shattered, and the monster within was revealed. She lunged for the microphone, her face a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "He's a little liar, a dramatic, worthless brat," she shrieked, her words echoing in the horrified silence. It was a confession, more damning than any document. The second individual with Julian, a calm woman in a pantsuit, walked onto the stage. "Isabella Carmichael," she said, her voice firm. "I'm Agent Davis from Child Protective Services. We have an emergency court order to take Leo into our custody. You and Mr. Renshaw need to come with us." The downfall was swift, total, and brutally public. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The story of the philanthropic couple who tortured and stole from their own child was a sensation, their public ruin as spectacular as their ascent. Stripped of their wealth and reputation, their legal defense crumbled. Mark, facing a slew of fraud and endangerment charges, turned on Isabella in a desperate attempt to save himself, revealing even more horrific details of their systematic cruelty. In the end, justice was absolute. Mark Renshaw was sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and aggravated child endangerment. Isabella Carmichael, the woman who had cried crocodile tears for vulnerable children, lost all parental rights and was sentenced to 20 years, the judge citing her profound and monstrous betrayal of a mother's sacred duty. The money, or what was left of it, was recovered and placed in a new, ironclad trust for Leo. Julian, through Evelyn Reed's masterful legal work, was granted temporary, then permanent legal guardianship of the boy. The transition was delicate. The first few weeks in Julian's quiet, spacious home, Leo was a ghost. He didn't speak. He ate little. He would spend hours in the room Julian had prepared for him, filled with books he didn't read and art supplies he didn't touch. He would flinch if Julian moved too quickly, his eyes constantly darting towards the doors as if expecting a monster to appear. Julian was endlessly patient. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply provided a constant, calming presence. He would sit in the room with Leo and read his own book, letting the boy grow accustomed to his silence. He made simple, nutritious meals and left them for him. He created a world of absolute safety and predictability, a world without shouting, without threats, without the terrifying fight for breath. Slowly, like a frostbitten flower turning towards a winter sun, Leo began to thaw. It started with small things. He began to finish his meals. He picked up a crayon and drew a simple blue circle. One evening, as Julian was reading in the living room, Leo came out of his room and sat on the far end of the sofa, simply existing in the same space. It was a monumental step, a silent acknowledgement of trust. 6 months later, the sterile mansion in the old neighborhood was a distant memory. Julian had sold it along with most of his city assets. He bought a sprawling, light-filled house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, a place of wind and waves and endless sky. The air was clean and salty, a world away from the suffocating atmosphere of Leo's previous life. The move had been transformative for the boy. With the help of a gentle, patient therapist, he had begun to find his voice again, first in whispers, then in hesitant sentences. He was still quiet, but his silence was no longer born of terror. It was a peaceful, contemplative quiet. He was learning to be a child, discovering the simple joys of chasing seagulls on the beach and drawing pictures with a full box of crayons, every color at his disposal. One bright, windswept afternoon, Julian was standing on the deck, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. He was no longer just a millionaire, a protector, or a man avenging the ghosts of his past. He was a father. The role felt more real, more profound than any corporate title he had ever held. He heard the sliding door open behind him. Leo walked out onto the deck, clutching a new drawing. He held it up for Julian to see. It was a picture of the house on the cliff. 2 stick figures stood on the deck, one tall and one small. They were holding hands, and above them, the sun was not crying. It was a brilliant, blazing yellow, with rays of light stretching to every corner of the page. Leo looked up at Julian, his brown eyes clear and bright. He didn't say a word. He just leaned forward and wrapped his small arms around Julian's leg, holding on tight. In that simple, profound gesture, a broken world was made whole again. And so, a quiet man's vow, forged in the fires of his own past, brought light into the darkest of corners. It served as a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in the noise of public acclaim or the accumulation of wealth, but in the silent, unwavering resolve to protect the innocent. Evil often wears a beautiful mask, thriving in the shadows of polite society, but it cannot withstand the glare of truth. It shatters under the weight of one person's courage to simply stand up and say, "No more." How many silent victims are waiting for a voice? How often do we turn away from a darkness we don't want to see? The world is full of quiet injustices, happening just behind a closed door or a polite smile. Have you ever witnessed something that didn't feel right and wished you could do more? Please share your stories and thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we are so grateful for every one of you who chooses to use it for good. Thank you for being a part of this community, and may you always have the courage to be a light in someone's darkness.